Hello and welcome to part 3 of the AS History Topic Guide for Tsarist Russia. In this one, we're going to be covering the period of 1894 to 1917, which is solely the period of Nicholas II. In the September of 1894, Alexander III died at the age of 49 quite suddenly, leaving his 26-year-old son Nicholas as the Tsar. However, due to his unexpected death, Nicholas II admitted he had little idea of how to rule, as he'd not been taught before of the mannerisms and the way that he should be ruling. However, he felt he had a God-given duty to fulfill, as all the Tsars before him had done, and he was determined to rule as his father had done. In 1904, the Russo-Japanese War broke out, and it was one of the most influential events that led up to the 1905 revolution for Nicholas II. It all started by, in January, the Japanese attacked the Russian naval base at Port Arthur in the Far East. Plekhiyev, the Minister for Internal Affairs, thinking that it would be quite a short victory, called for a short, swift, victorious war, which in turn would distract attention away from discontent at home and turn it into patriotism. In March, however, Russian forces were defeated at Mukden, with 90,000 Russians in total killed. And in May, 24 out of 27 ships of the Russian fleet were sunk at the Battle of Tsushima. As a result, in 1904, Russia surrendered the naval base at Port Arthur, and these defeats basically turned initial anti-Japanese patriotism into discontent and therefore increased opposition to the government. The events of the Russo-Japanese War swiftly turned into the 1905 revolution due to the discontent that it brought, and it was only fueled by events such as Bloody Sunday. Here are the list of events, but I'm just going to be talking about 4 because they're the major ones that we need to remember. On the 9th of January, a date now known as Bloody Sunday for Russians, Father Gapon led a peaceful march of about 20,000 workers to the Winter Palace, with a petition demanding improved working conditions and political reform. We have to remember that this was a peaceful march. However, troops fired on the marchers as they panicked, and it led to over 100 deaths. However, these troops weren't ordered by the Tsar. However, that's what the people interpreted it as, due to the fact that they were the Tsar's guards. In fact, the Tsar wasn't even at the palace that they went with the petition to. In March, an all-Russian Union of Railway Workers was established, and the Soviets of elected factory workers were formed to coordinate strikes. This is one of the major kind of foundations for the Soviets, and the fact that they actually had support. It meant that unions and kind of people were banding together to create opposition where it had never been done before. A couple of months later, in June, there was a naval mutiny on the battleship Potemkin, and in Odysseia the authorities tried to disperse sympathetic crowds, killing more than 2,000 people. However, we have to take in mind that the navy and the military were still on the side of the Tsar in this revolution, which was his downfall in 1917 due to the fact they weren't, but we'll get to that one a little bit later. On the 6th of August, however, Nicholas promised a restricted State Duma, which revolutionaries disregarded as weak. However, it was changed into the October Manifesto, and some people actually agreed with this. The October Manifesto itself was only produced because of the increasing pressure from his advisors, and the Tsar issued a decree promising that they would have civil liberties such as freedom of speech, press and assembly for all, and he also promised a State Duma, and this was elected by universal suffrage to pass laws. Universal suffrage just means everyone can vote apart from a few chosen people by the Tsar. The reception of this manifesto was very split due to the fact that most liberals, including the cadets, progressives and Octoberists, accepted the manifesto. However, the socialist revolutionaries and the social democrats rejected it. Many workers were unconvinced by the Tsar's promises and continued to support the SRs and the SDs. The October Manifesto actually split the opposition rather than joining it, which is a big issue. And as is a given, peasant risings still continued, especially with hopes of land redistribution. The Tsar actually managed to recover a little bit during this period, as most of the army remained loyal and helped to storm the headquarters of the Moscow and St. Petersburg Soviets in the November-December period of 1905. Most of the leaders of the Soviets were arrested and many troops were executed or exiled to Siberia. Troops restored order in the countryside and government promised to end redemption payments, which is a huge issue for the peasantry due to the fact that they've been living with this and they have to pay for 49 years. The fact that they've now been having all their debts taken off them now makes it able for a new society to be founded with the peasantry. The October Manifesto split the opposition so much that Peter Struve, a liberal, said, "Thank God for the Tsar who has saved us from the people." A new constitution was drawn up and political parties were legalized for the election, even though the Bolsheviks and the SRs refused. However, 4 days before the First Duma met, the Tsar issued the Fundamental Laws. And these laws were basically a violation of what the Duma was going to actually do, and it proclaimed the rights in which the Tsar had and which he believed would be fulfilled. The fundamental laws were as follows: that he had the right to exercise supreme autocratic power, initiate legislation and approve laws himself, appoint and dismiss ministers whenever he chose, summon and dissolve the Duma, and also rule by decree in an emergency state or when the Duma was not in session. This as a whole just proves that the Tsar had never had any intention of becoming a constitutional monarch, as he always had autocracy in mind at the time. The First Duma lasted between May and June of 1906 and only lasted a month. It was dominated by the cadets and radicals with many peasant representatives. He demanded radical constitutional change, and it passed a vote of no confidence in government and was therefore dissolved by the Tsar. The Second Duma only lasted between February and June, so it was an expansion from the first one, as this one lasted 4 months. This Duma, however, had Peter Stolypin as the new Prime Minister, engineering all the elections to increase the amount of Octoberists, and therefore the people that are happy with the idea of Duma and how it's actually affecting the people. However, with this one, the Bolsheviks and the SRs actually participated in, and they increased the number of radical deputies in the Duma. This Duma opposed most Tsarist proposals, including agrarian reform, and it was dissolved and leading radicals were therefore exiled. The Third Duma lasted between 1907 of November and June of 1912, being one of the most longest serving Dumas at the time, apart from the last one. In this Duma, Stolypin introduced an emergency law to reduce the representation of peasants, and this meant consequentially that Octoberists and conservatives dominated, and the Duma was more compliant and actually worked with the Tsar during this period. However, near the end, there were still some disputes with the Tsar, and it was twice suspended by him. The Fourth Duma, however, lasted between 1912 of November to 1917 of November as well, so a good lengthy 5-year period. However, in this Duma, the right and left-wing deputies couldn't cooperate, and the Duma was increasingly ignored during the time of war. However, it did actually manage to vote for war credits in 1914, but was suspended in 1915 after demanding more power. So it shows, as Nicholas promised the Dumas, they actually didn't manage to do much at all due to the fact still being an autocrat and leading the country by himself. Even with these disputes going on at the time of political unrest, industrialized transformation was the best that Russia had ever seen during this period, due to the fact that Sergei Veit was spearheading it, and he believed that the industrialization was essential to curb revolutionary unrest. Consequently, the drive for growth continued, and from 1892 to 1914, the Russian economy actually grew at a rate of 8% per annum. Industrialized growth was largely state-managed, and this was done by the reforms of and actions of that interest rates were raised to encourage foreign loans, which had been what the ministers of Vidnogradsky and Rutan had done in the period before, and also what Sergei Veit was going for as well. A new ruble, backed by the value of gold, was built and was issued in 1897, which is a huge thing for Russia as it managed to increase business confidence, and it also made the conversion rates actually better for them, as before they had it on silver and no one really had the rates to compare them to be able to transfer the French currency to the Russian currency. And now it is both backed on gold that actually had a direct comparison, and it allowed more trade to happen. Foreign capital was raised to fund the development of railways, electricity plants, mining, and also oil fields at the time, due to the fact that Russia is that vast that the amount of raw materials they had was a vast amount to match the landscape. In this period as well, heavy industry was prioritised over lighter industry, due to the fact that war was looming and it had to be done. So you don't want to be mining and kind of farming and having cotton works when you need iron, steel, and the upper industrial things to be produced. Due to Sergei Veit being the finance minister for Russia at the time, by 1914 Russia had 62,000 kilometers of railway track, the second longest in the whole world. The Trans-Siberian Railway, as it is known, was built to link European Russia with the Far East. This would increase communication, be able to transport troops, as was seen in the Russo-Japanese War. However, it still wasn't enough due to them still being quite a way behind. Railway development stimulated heavy industries, reduced transport costs for manufacturers, and also provided government revenue because it allowed raw materials from places that hadn't been mined before to be mined due to transport being there. However, the cost of industrialization itself was very high, and Russia became dependent on foreign investment, which increased nearly 10 times from 1880 to 1900. However, by 1914, Russia was the fifth largest industrial power. While Russia industrialized at a very rapid rate from the 1890s, agriculture, on the other hand, remained at a very small scale and also very inefficient. Stolypin wanted to change this, and as he was the Minister of the Interior in 1906, he believed that a radical reform of agriculture was required in order to prevent further peasant unrest. He wanted to increase individual peasant ownership as to create a new class of kulaks who were self-profited and profit-orientated farmers who would improve agriculture and above all support the new regime. The agricultural legislation itself meant that the mere system and collective ownership of land by families was abolished in 1906 in November. As promised, in 1905, redemption payments were abolished, and in January 1907 it came to fruition, and peasants became free to leave their villages. Peasants can now apply for permission to consolidate scattered strips into single farms, which now meant that they could basically have more land together. A new peasant land bank was also established to be able to fund the purchases for some peasants, and government subsidiaries were introduced to encourage settlement into Siberia as they were increased, to make sure that people tried to move to land which hadn't been farmed before, and also spread out the population. The successes of the legislation were that peasant ownership of land increased from 20% in 1905 to nearly 50% in 1915. Grain production rose annually, and by 1909 Russia was the world's leading cereal exporter. Some peasants, the kulaks, consolidated their land, often buying out poorer peasants to create more efficient and profitable peasant farms. Around 3.5 million peasants moved from overpopulated areas to Siberia, which created a major agricultural region for their dairy and cereals. Some peasants, however, sold out and moved to other towns to find work, which actually boosted the industrial labour supply because it meant that more workers were actually working now. However, there were many failures of the legislation as well, as by 1914 only around 10% of land had been transferred from communal to private ownership. In 1914, 90% of peasant holdings were still based on scattered strips. Peasants were still reluctant to change farming methods, as there was still largely uneducated, as this has been how they'd been brought up to believe, and the traditional farming techniques that still already have been using and will continue to use. Siberia, however, proved difficult terrain for those who relocated there, as the ground was often unfertile, and due to the very, very cold conditions there, it meant that plants would die all the time, and produce was now very hard to make. Stolypin and his reforms did not address the key issue that the redistribution of land was held by the nobility, who now retained 50% of the land, and land hunger still remained. So it didn't really counter the idea of famine and kind of land and food, as it still meant that it was a large disappointment. However, it was a stepping stone towards achieving what people wanted to do in the future, as was targeted by Lenin with food, peace and land. There were also many social developments by 1914, as industrialization was one of the key aspects of that. As industrialization helped strengthen the Russian economy, it brought a number of changes, some of which were proved to be detrimental to the Tsarist regime, and now a new middle class and urban class emerged from this. The middle class, made up of factory and workshop owners, managers, traders, professionals, such as bankers, doctors and teachers, became more prominent in society, and many decided to play a major role in the Zemstva. However, the lack of a national assembly, at any rate until 1906 when the Dumas came into place, often made them opponents of the regime. The urban population quadrupled from 7 to 28 million, and between 1867 and 1917 this was the case. And by 1914, factory workers made up nearly 10% of the whole entire population. However, most of these workers suffered appalling working and living conditions, and mortality rates were very high. Some rented rooms in overcrowded blocks, while others housed a barrack-style factory accommodation where they ate and slept, and had communal canteens and shared bathhouses. However, there were a large number of unfortunate people who slept alongside their machines in factories, and around 40% of rented houses in St. Petersburg had no running water, and sewage was collected in handcarts. So it shows that society was still very backwards, as 40% of people in this time didn't have any running water in their house. The urban growth itself meant that there was limited to no regulation in the workplace. It allowed employers to pay minimal wages, which failed to keep pace with inflation. So it meant that basically the wages meant nothing to some of them. Women, who comprised a fifth of the workforce by 1914, were the lowest paid, and an industrial depression from 1900 to 1908 hit the workers really hard due to this inflation and the fact that they weren't being paid much at all anyways. Unions and strikes were officially banned before 1905, although some strikes took place illegally and usually suppressed violently by the Ukraine at the time, and also military in some circumstances. However, there was some improvement in the provision of education and social welfare, but due to the fact that these demands came in, it snowballed kind of, and it meant that more things were being asked of. So you can see with the table that in 1885, night work for children and women was banned. Then, along with more rights, in 1886, contracts of employment had to be drawn up. Now, skip forward 8 years, then employment of children under 12 and female labour in mines were banned. Now, 5 years later, working hours were reduced to 11.5 a day, which is still quite a lot, but it wasn't anything like it was before. Factory inspectorate was expanded. Now, the biggest one, 1905, trade unions were made legal, as this allowed the Soviet to manoeuvre and actually make unions. A couple of years later, sickness and accident insurance for workers was introduced, and this was right on the brink of World War One. So these kind of things had to be introduced to make sure that the workers worked and kept productivity high. And in 1914, normal factory hours were reduced to 10 hours per day, which is 1.5 hours less than beforehand. And it just shows the development of what they were asking for, and how it meant that when you kind of, with the kettle kind of analogy, the saucepan analogy in my one a couple of whiles back, with the steam in the pan, and you kind of lift off the little bit, and the steam kind of builds up in there, and then you lift it off a little bit more, and then like eventually more and more steam comes out. And it basically just shows with this, due to the fact that more and more reforms were getting pushed through due to demands. With this snowball effect, it also came with an industrial militancy, as real wages declined in the years of 1910 to 1913 because of the inflation, and an employer's squeeze on wages in the face of the growing world competition meant that, unsurprisingly, there were numerous strikes in these years. In 1912, the miners at Lena goldfields in Siberia went out on strike. Around 500 were killed, and when the army intervened, this was one of over 2,000 separate strikes across Russia in 1912. And in 1913 there were 24,000 strikes, and in 1914 there were over 1 million strikes altogether across the country, which led to, in July 1914, a general strike broke out in St. Petersburg, but ended just before war began on April 1st, and it had the potential to kind of devastate Russia just before the war. Likewise, with the living and working conditions in the countryside, many peasants continue to live at subsistence level, and then they also met very different problems to the workers, as although the workers had houses and such forth, peasants were subject to recurrent famine, as in 1891 to 92 there was a famine, in 1898 there was a famine, and in 1901 there was also a famine. Grain output per acre was less than a third of that of Britain or Germany, yet peasants were driven hard to produce a surplus for export and pay high taxes as well. This was because food was being taken off them to kind of export elsewhere, due to the fact that they needed money to be coming into the country straight on the brink of war as well. The gap between richer peasants, the new class of kulaks, who could afford to employ labour, and landless peasants, kind of expanded between them and the landless peasants, as too few moved to the towns to ease the pressure on the poorest, and very few had access to doctors' resources, meaning that the living standards and living estimated age was very low still in the countryside. However, living standards did vary from region to region, but the worser areas were to provide much of the Bolsheviks' strongest support later when it came to it. Not only was there a gap between the kulaks and the peasants, there were also now a gap between the nobility and the newly founded middle class. Although about a third of the nobles' land was transferred to the peasants and town dwellers between 1861 and the outbreak of war in 1914, the majority of the nobles actually retained their landed wealth, while the Tsar relied on them to fill the top positions in government. As industrialization also gained pace, so an emerging middle class of businessmen and professionals grew in size. A minority of nobles' sons also entered the world of industry and commerce, as did a number of enterprising peasants, which would have been the kulaks, and many of the middle class also served on the Zemstva. The influence of the church in this period was also quite high due to the fact that the Tsar controlled it, and religion was still a big thing due to the kind of belief in heaven and hell, and them being easily influenced by this, as was the case in the Middle Ages. Due to the Orthodox Church having close ties with the belief, with the belief of the Tsar, it meant that the church backed the Tsar, as the Tsar ruled by divine right, according to tradition. The Orthodox Church also exercised considerable sway over the minds of the superstitious, which was a great benefit of the Tsarist regime due to the fact that the peasantry was still ill-educated, and it meant that heaven and hell still had a major impact on them, as would it have done in England in the Middle Ages. Priests had close ties with the village and were also expected to read out Tsarist decrees and inform the police of subversive activity. The church were the ones who exercised censorship and made sure them controls stayed in force, and also the church courts handed down punishments to social and moral crimes at the time. Under Alexander III, the church was given increased control over primary education, and it became an offence to actually convert from orthodoxy to any other faith in the world. The cultural changes, though, however, meant that the Orthodox Church had less hold over the growing working class in the cities, as for many of them, socialist ideas had become more appealing to them, due to the fact that religion wasn't even religion in this period, really. It was more of an ideology, due to the fact that the Orthodox Church kind of represented Tsarist control and control of the people. Socialist ideas kind of brought a new freedom, so it was more appealing to the people. Economic development from 1894 to 1914 brought new opportunities for women as educational provision expanded, and by 1914 45% of the children aged between 8 and 11 were in primary school. This was an expansion on Alexander III's reforms due to the fact that primary education was free during that period. By 1914, an increasing number of books were being published, and the popular press flourished after censorship was ended in 1905, which was a huge thing due to the fact that cheap editions of the novels of Tolstoy and Dostoevsky were produced for the newly literate, as it meant that people were now getting like opposition propaganda and more things through to them. By 1914, Russian culture had widened and embraced more than just the elite, as it was affecting the workers and also possibly the countryside. Nevertheless, millions of people still remained highly respectful towards the autocracy and the Orthodox Church, and millions of people came out onto the streets of St. Petersburg, Moscow and other cities on the 300th anniversary of the Romanov dynasty in 1913. However, there was a growth of liberal opposition due to the fact that industrial and education expansion produced a middle class, and this middle class wanted to seek liberal change due to their working conditions and living conditions. Liberal priorities were civil rights and a state Duma which would initiate and pass laws. These liberals were strongly represented in the Zemstva. Many of them were professionals who were highly critical of the regime. Alexander III's introduction of land captains in 1889 meant that he removed the complaining Zemstva members, and he was able to overrule Zemstva decisions. And this act by the Tsar of the time increased opposition in those people he removed, and it meant that more liberal intellectuals kind of stood up to the Tsarist regime during this period. Liberal intellectuals such as the author Leo Tolstoy also helped popularise the need for political change due to the fact he was writing books and propaganda, and it came to the fact that even Z.V. Zubotov, who was the head of the Moscow Okhrana, favoured liberalisation and was also given permission to legalise trade unions in 1900. However, this experiment was abandoned in 1903 when one union attempted to participate a general strike across the whole of Moscow. Many liberal ideas and ideology kind of flourished in this time, as frustrated liberals formed Beseda, which was the first organised liberal opposition group in 1899. This later merged with the Union of Liberation, which was founded by Peter Struve in 1903. Struve had always been a Marxist, but he was opposed to violent revolution, and he believed in a constitutional government such as the Duma. However, Union members wished to see the Tsarist regime also develop into a constitutional monarchy. So it was a change. Instead of having a government, it was a constitutional monarchy instead. And it resulted with 50 banquets attended by the liberal elite were held over the winter of 1904 to spread the union's message as they both combined. Um, Liberal opposition had limited political influence before 1905 as the Okrana were being very, very repressive, and it meant that words, and due to censorship being limited, it meant that people couldn't actually get out their message. However, after 1905, they were mostly won over by the October Manifesto and also the establishment of the Duma, due to the fact that they wanted these things to come into place. However, these people, known as the Beseda, were actually largely represented by the cadets, who were the constitutional Democrats, who favoured a constitutional monarchy with a parliamentary government, which included full civil rights, the compulsory redistribution of nobles' estates, and also the legal settlement of the internal industrial disputes. The Tsar and had a very different kind of reaction to the liberals, due to the fact that the liberals tried to cooperate through the Duma with the Tsarist government, but they were actually very frustrated by the increasing intransigence of the Tsar and his advisors, due to the fact that they weren't actually listening to them. A number of cadet leaders were arrested after the dissolution of the First Duma due to their views. Then after dissolving the Second Duma in 1907, the Tsarist government altered the franchise so that the electorate was reduced in size, due to the fact that if you reduce the electorate in size, and also with Stolypin rigging the elections, it meant that a less amount of people who demanded reforms and revolutionaries were actually getting into the Duma. He also increasingly ignored and overruled the Dumas, and he resorted to emergency powers to pass laws whenever he wanted, really. And there was really actually not much of a constitutional monarchy by the time of 1914, when the war broke out. More radical opposition was being brought in this time, but it was slow to develop, as by 1894, after years of oppression by Alexander III, the populist ideal of peasant-based land in revival in Russia seemed very far off. However, recurring famines led to the revival of the idea of rural socialism. This was brought by the Socialist Revolutionary Party, or known as the SRs. The Socialist Revolutionary Party, that was established in 1901, combined the ideology of Marxism with the previous populist belief in land redistribution. Chernov edited the party journal and called it the Revolutionary Russia, and called on both peasants and urban workers to challenge autocracy. The SRs carried out 2,000 political assassinations from 1901 to 1905, and in 1911 they actually managed to assassinate Peter Stolypin. However, over 2,000 SRs were executed in the process. Another radical opposition party was the Social Democratic Workers' Party. Marxist ideas in this period gained more support as industrialization increased and the urban working class grew in size. In 1883, Plekhanov established the first Russian Marxist association, the Emancipation of Labour, in Geneva it was called. It smuggled Marxist literature into Russia, encouraging urban workers to collaborate with the bourgeoisie in order to overthrow Tsardom. Plekhanov believed attempts to rouse peasantry were futile, as they wouldn't listen due to the fact that what happened with the populists during Alexander II's time. Marxism attracted an educated following, including Vladimir Uklanov, who was known to be Lenin, from 1901. Lenin had been attracted to Marxism, but when he was a St. Petersburg law student, this is when he first learned about it. He met Plekhanov on a tour of Europe in 1895, but was arrested and exiled to Siberia until 1900s. This was better than what happened to his brother due to the fact he was hung after the assassination of Alexander II. However, when the Social Democrat Party was formed, only 9 delegates attended, but these delegates wrote a manifesto and elected a 3-man central committee, 2 of whom were instantly arrested, which was a big issue for them, as like two out of the 9 were instantly cut down. From exile in Switzerland, Lenin wrote for the party newspaper Iskra, or was known as the Spark, from 1902, and produced a pamphlet, What is to be Done. In 1903, 51 delegates attended the Second Congress in Brussels, then London, but disagreements between Lenin and Martov, the co-edition of the Iskra, split ranks. Lenin's followers became known as the Bolsheviks, meaning majority, after winning a crucial vote, while Martov's followers were called Mensheviks, meaning minority. The differences between the two followers were quite apparent due to the fact that Lenin's followers wanted a small, centrally controlled, highly disciplined party of professional revolutionaries who would work and lead the revolution on behalf of the workers, whereas Martov wanted a democracy party that was open to all people of any kind of social rank or kind of background. Lenin refused to work with other parties and trade unions, whereas Martov he was willing to cooperate with other parties and trade unions. Lenin's followers believed in the bourgeoisie and the proletarian revolution could occur simultaneously at the same time, whereas Martov believed that the workers should lead the revolution and that a proletariat revolution could only happen after the bourgeoisie revolution. Both the SRs and the SDs rejected the October Manifesto and called for a general strike that was organised by the St. Petersburg Soviet in the November of 1905. However, after 1905, the radical opposition had no clear leader. This was due to the fact that there was a split between Lenin and Martov, and the political opposition couldn't even decide what they wanted themselves from this manifesto. And Leon Trotsky, the chairman of the St. Petersburg Soviet, was exiled to Siberia, and Lenin, who only just returned from exile in November, fled to Finland in December, just 1 month later. The government still had opposition, especially from the trade union, many of which had closed down. The government failed to pacify working class discontent, but the Tsarist autocracy realistically was not in any grave danger before 1914, due to the fact that the opposition was not combined or kind of on the same front at any kind of period. However, the thing that was able to unite the whole of the Russian opposition was in fact the military defeats of World War I. This came to fruition due to the fact that as Germany declared war on Russia on the 19th of July, it united the country. Not only opposition at the time, due to the fact that opposition at first were helping with the campaign, it quickly turned into discontent and anger against the Tsar. As the vast Russian army was assembled, a surge of patriotism swept the country. Strikes ceased, and the Duma voted for war credits. An all-Russian Zemstvo Union for the relief of sick and wounded soldiers was formed. St. Petersburg was renamed Petrograd to sound less German. The country was divided into military zones. Civilian authority was suspended, and the sale of alcohol was forbidden due to kind of the early stages of rationing. Despite some initial successes on the Austrian front in August 1914, the invasion of East Prussia met strong German resistance, and huge defeats were inflicted at the Battle of Tannenberg, which was in August 1914, which left 300,000 Russian soldiers wounded or dead, and also the Battle of Masurian Lakes in September 1914. A massive a massive Russian retreat began on both the German and Austrian fronts, and reports of inadequate clothing and footwear and a shortage of food and ammunitions, such as 2 rifles to every 3 soldiers, were published. It had a massive political effect on the country due to the fact that Zemstva resented their loss of authority when they were doing more for medical relief than the government. Local and national industries assumed responsibility for supplies in the absence of Tsarist action. They encouraged political ambitions. The Zemstva and Duma accused the government of incompetence, pointing, for example, to the futility of the alcohol ban, as peasants brewed their own alcohol, so it's pointless. In August 1915, cadets, Octoberists, and progressives in the Duma formed the Progressive Bloc that demanded a change of ministers and constitutional reform. They effectively demanded a constitutional monarchy in which the Tsar would genuinely share power. The Tsar therefore suspended the Duma. On the 23rd of August 1915, the Tsar took over as commander-in-chief over the armed forces, despite his lack of military experience. This due to be his massive downfall, due to the fact that he was actually out there on the battlefield, well, behind the lines, but on the battlefield, commanding troops, meaning that all blame could actually be directed back to him instead of military incompetence. Although the government mobilised about 15 million men between 1917, it was unable to provide sufficient clothing or suitable weapons for them. As I said, Nicholas was held responsible for the failure of the Brusilov offensive. A lack of trained officers and Russia's underdeveloped railway network contributed to the defeat, which therefore sapped morale and provoked desertions. The Tsarina Alexandra, who was a German, and the intensely unpopular Rasputin, assumed much influence over the government at this time due to Nicholas's absence. Rumours spread that they were sabotaging the Russian war effort, and confidence in the regime fell. Rodzinenko, who was president of the Fourth Duma, which reconvened in the February of 1916, warned Nicholas, but he didn't respond. Rasputin was assassinated by Prince Yaspukov in the December of 1916 in quite a gruesome way due to the fact he was poisoned. He didn't die to poison. He was shot. He didn't die to being shot, but actually drowned in the end. The economic and social impact of the war was absolutely devastating due to the fact that the war drained Russia completely. Costs rose from 1,500 million rubles in 1914 to 14,500 million rubles by 1918 for a war that they lost completely. While production slumped as workers and peasants were conscripted to fight, there were vital distribution inefficiencies, partly due to the fact that the inadequate railway system, which was disrupted by fuel shortages, but also because railways were prioritised for soldiers and military supplies, leaving food destined for civilians to rot in railway sidings. Peasants made the situation worse by hoarding grain because there was nothing to buy, so they therefore stockpiled it, meaning that workers suffered unemployment as non-military factories were forced to close down due to a lack of raw materials. Petrograd in particular saw a 300% rise in the cost of living, also saw an escalation in strikes. This as a whole led to the downfall of Nicholas, which we'll be talking about in the next one. But the whole idea of the revolution of 1905 meant that Nicholas kind of was seen to be weak, and the Bloody Sunday and the lack of reform after that was meant that discontent rose as a whole, and World War One was basically the final straw for the Russians, and they wanted to see their Tsar be toppled and get rid of the autocracy. and there was a big power struggle after Nicholas, and we'll be talking about that in the next one. So until the next time, we'll catch you for the provisional government.